Nothing like the sound of a good saxophone, huh? Kind of gives you that old school Rounders feeling. Anyway, so here are the hand histories I've been talking about nonstop and not been doing. So this is from Friday, February 21st and Saturday the 22nd, I think. We'll start with the 21st. So in this first hand, I was still pretty new to the game. There was an early position limp, and I've got Jack 10 suited in the cutoff. I raised to 25. The button calls, the limper calls, and we go three-way. The flop is king, queen, queen, 2 diamonds and a club, so I got the open-ender, but no backdoor flush draw. Obviously, there's a possible full house, and we all check. Turn is another king, and we all check again, and the river is a 3. It checks to me. I overbet 110 into 75, I guess. The button thinks for a little bit, and he calls. Dang it. The other guy folds. I show the jack high, and he shows the same hand. Jack 10 offsuit. So that much was at least a pleasant surprise, although kind of annoying he didn't just fold. And of course, considering he didn't fold jack high, I don't think he would have folded ace high, which was basically the one hand I'm trying to make fold. When he did call, I figured it's either that or pocket threes. Now, as far as the line I took, well, I don't think betting flop with this hand is at all necessary, although I think at times I probably would have bet with it. But if no one bets the flop, I could still make the straight or bluff and win later, especially since my hand blocks king jack, queen jack, king 10, and queen 10. If either player had a king, I think one of them would have bet at some point before it was my action on the river. The player likeliest to have a queen would have been the early position player, because once he checks to me, the pre-flop raiser, and the action checks behind, the board double pairing the king is going to disincentivize him from betting, as it's going to be quite difficult to get called by anything. The button could have checked back a queen on the flop, but the field tends to bet a hand that strong in position, especially with flush and straight draws already present. The biggest issue with the size I used on the river is it's really polarizing my range to either a bluff or having a king. If I was trying to rep having either a king or a queen, I would have definitely have to size down a little, but I didn't want to do that because then I thought ace high might call. But if I did have a king, I'd have definitely played it the same way, checking flop and turn before betting river. The only difference is I'd have bet a lot smaller on the river. Now, I got called by jack high this time, but most often that's not going to happen. And this has been happening a lot lately in single race pots, or even limp pots when I'm in one on the blinds. Sometimes when there's just been no action on the flop or turn, it seems apparent that nobody gives a shit about this hand and is going to make no effort to win the pot. So if you fire some random huge size out of nowhere into a pot that no one has really put anything into, these days everyone tends to either just back away without thinking about it, or they raise, which means they'll have probably wound up with a set or straight somehow. So this just tells you the play is going to make money since it's only getting action from the unusually big hand. As far as his river call goes, well, I mean, I understand why he did it. He shouldn't be losing to an ace-high bluff, since that hand should have showdown value, and a king is really my only value hand for this size, so I either have that, or maybe I'm just bluffing with a pocket pair, or, in this case, with a hand he can chop with. But I still think for sure that the only player who's going to call me here is someone like this guy, who's just a random recreational player that I've never seen before and probably won't see after today. Now, I know this hand is only going to generate so much excitement, but the reason I'm mentioning it is because of this next hand. Now, I'm not telling all these hands in order, but a few hours later, that same guy straddled, the one who called me with jack high. It folds to me. I got queen, 6 of clubs in the big blind. I raise to 40, and he defends the straddle. The flop is ace, ace, 10, 2 clubs, so I got the flush draw. I think a little while and check, and then he checks. The turn is another 10. I bet small, 25, and he calls. The river is a blank, so I've still got queen high. Pot is about 130, and I still try it again and bet 120. He tanks for a little bit, tells me he has a 10. Thinking, okay, great, there's no way this is going to work. But then after due consideration, he shows it to me, and he folds. Go figure, huh? Now, I took my time checking the flop because I wanted to get him thinking I could have an ace that I'm not sure how I want to play, and once he checked back the flop, I continued that story when I bet small on the turn. Checking still might be better on the turn, but when he called, I didn't think he had jack high this time, but he certainly could have had king high. And if he did, should I be confident he'll fold it after having seen him call with jack high before? Maybe, because now the whole metagame can come into play. And even though neither of these pots are big, now the whole I know that you know that I know that you know that I know has entered the picture. Now, I for sure never expected him to fold a 10, but I thought if I went big enough without going over the pot that he may not call with his king highs this time, since he knows that I know that he doesn't mind making a light call. So I was pretty fortunate to get a fold from that hand, but the most satisfying part about it was when he said something like, I'm so sure that you had an ace there. All right. Glad to hear it. But okay, on to the next hand. We're going to rewind a couple hours now. I had just lost a medium-sized pot with a big combo draw that I had to fold on the turn. The board paired and the guy jammed, and it was too risky to call, so I was a little annoyed about that. A couple of hands later, a fish limps in the low jack, and a brand new player limped in the cutoff, and he also looked fishy. I got jack 9 off on the button, I raised to 30, and they both called. Definitely a little loose, but whatever. It's allowed. Flop comes 10-9-5 rainbow, and they check, and I check. Turn is an 8 of diamonds, so now there's a flush draw. First guy checks, and the new face bets 60. I don't have any diamonds, but I call. And the first limper thought for a long time, and then he overcalled. The river was the king of diamonds, so the backdoor flush came in, and they both checked to me. Now, I've said this before, that I've been seeing very little out-of-position checking on the river with big hands, especially multi-way, so I figured neither guy has a flush. And it really doesn't matter that I don't have any blockers, because if neither player is going to check a flush, then it's not important to have a blocker for that reason. The reason I would rather still have a blocker is because having a diamond in this spot means it blocks them from having the blocker themselves. Now, since the pot is 270, I thought the best way to get after this one was to go pretty huge, so I went close to 2 times the pot, going 515. And the first guy goes into the tank, and he's in a bit of agony. But he cuts out the chips from his stack, and god damn it, I really thought he was going to call too, so I'm already bracing myself for the shittiness I'm about to feel of overbet bluffing and losing. But he's still agonizing. And then he says, I can't call you. And he folds. And then the other guy folds right away. Phew! Then the guy who was tanking announced that he had jack 7, which was the second nut straight on the turn, since that hand only loses to queen jack, and holy shit. So you see the effectiveness of what these really large sizes can have against certain players. Because if he's folding that hand, then that means he's probably folding every hand except flushes. And if he had a flush, I mean, yeah, maybe he checks. Maybe he does, but he probably bets like I'm seeing everyone else do. But I wasn't too worried about him showing up with a flush, not just because he checked, but because of how long it took him to overcall the turn. I've said this before, when people have draws and are planning to call, usually they just call right away because their mind is already made up. Now, given that he had jack 7, he was obviously thinking about raising, and had he done so, there's no doubt he's going to win the hand, and he probably just wins it on the turn, but the point is, with the amount of time he took to call on the turn, I thought it was extremely unlikely that he had a flush draw. And since I can easily have one, once both of them check to me, it's just an invitation to go bombs away with or without a blocker. So for this next hand, the straddle is on. Folds to me in the cutoff. I have 6-5 of diamonds, and I raise to 30. It folded to the straddler, and he 3-bet to 90. And he was about 14 or 1500 deep, so I called. The flop was 9-deuce-3 rainbow, so I had a gutter ball to the nuts and a backdoor flush draw. He bet 60 for 1/3 of the pot, and I thought about raising, but I called. And the turn was the 4. Oh, hi, how you doing? And still no flush draw. And now he bet pretty big, 225, about 3/4 pot. And I considered raising again because now he felt really strong, but I still called. and the river paired the board. It was a 3. And then he went all in, overbet jamming for about 1,000, give or take. And I called right away, and he had the ace-5 offsuit for a wheel, so I stacked him. Yay. Now you'll notice I didn't nit roll the shit out of him by waiting a month before calling him, fearing that he could have pocket 9s. And had that been what he turned over, it wouldn't have been the biggest surprise of all time, but it doesn't matter. I'm still going to live and die with calling off here and ASAP because my hand beats just about everything. Now, with the straddle being on in an 8-handed game, I don't know if I'm in theory supposed to raise 6-5 suited in the cutoff, but I also don't care because the game was good and there wasn't much 3-betting. Now, of course, in this hand, yeah, now there's a 3-bet, but oh my god, did this guy fuck this hand up. First of all, with still 4 players left behind me, my cutoff raise isn't going to be such a loose range that he can ever expect to even get a small percentage of folds, never mind a high percentage of folds, when he 3-bets only to the pot size when he makes it 90. Now, I've heard conflicting arguments that say you should 3-bet really big out of position to disincentivize the in-position player from calling, and I've heard you should not 3-bet so huge out of position because the in-position player has such an advantage that you'd prefer the pot be smaller rather than larger when you do see a flop. But whichever side of the fence you're on, ace-5 offsuit is not a hand he's going to want to 3-bet with, and least of all to using a size that is so unlikely to get me to fold. And because he went so small, I actually considered 4-betting as well. And even though I stacked him, I still kind of wish I had. But bullshit 3-bet size or not, I guess I just tend not to 4-bet bluff in position that often, especially without any significant blockers, because I just seem to prefer to keep my range wider and the stack to pot ratio higher for all the post-flop scenarios. But as played, with the flop coming 9-deuce-3 rainbow, it certainly gives me the nut advantage since I can have pocket 2s or 3s, whereas he is very unlikely to. I thought it was unlikely he had a big hand pre-flop and right now since he only c-bet 1/3, but I've also been wrong in these spots before, so between that and the fact that my hand turns really well, I thought calling to peel one more would be best. It still keeps my range wide, and if I don't hit the 4 on the turn, but he bets again using a size that once again feels rather weak, or if he just checked, then now I will get aggressive because I've already thought about doing so twice. But instead the money card came, and now he's just about fucked. I mean, it's a really unlucky card for him on the turn, but he also did this to himself, so once again you make your own luck. And I said earlier I almost raised turn because now he felt really strong, but even if he does have a big overpair, raising him now is also going to look really, really, really nutted. And if that's what he has, I don't know how likely he is to fold or stack off with it. I mean, sometimes I sense a lot of strength and raise before I normally would want to or need to, and then they surprise me and they fold. Now, as far as what hands I'd be bluffing with if I did raise turn, well, I know I might find it here with either 5-4 or pocket 5s, but I probably wouldn't have done it against this sudden 3/4 pot size bet. And when you say that out loud, you've actually just given yourself an argument for raising with the nuts because you're afraid he's going to fold if you're bluffing. But I decided if he does have a big hand, he's going to bet again on a lot of rivers anyway, so let's just see what happens. Now, when the board paired 3s on the river, I wasn't afraid of losing to a full house. I mean, I mostly just didn't want it to pair so that he wouldn't fear that I have one. Now, I know after this turn card, it's mostly just a setup at this point, but his river jam is awful. I said in the last episode, or no, 2 episodes ago, that I hardly ever see overbets, and that's true. But when I do, it's usually for value, and this was for value as well, but this was utter suicide, because if I call him, he loses. Now, I really don't think I'd get here with an overpair as strong as queens, since his 3-bet pre was so small, but let's just say, for argument's sake, that I did. There is no way I'm calling this jam. I wouldn't raise pre with 5-3 suited from the cutoff when the straddle is on, so I wouldn't have that hand. Probably wouldn't raise even without that straddle being on. And I also wouldn't have called twice with ace-3 suited to have now river trip 3s. I'd have either 4-bet that hand pre or just folded turn. So that means my calling turn is now sets, the nut straight, or possibly ace-5 suited to chop with him. So that is why his jam is just free rolling himself. Because I'm either calling with those hands or folding everything he beats, like 5-4, pocket 5s, or any other pocket pair that I decide to call 2 streets with. Now, sometimes players just panic and spaz jam when they get a bad card, and I certainly have done that plenty of times in the past, and the reason they do it, and the reason I've done it, is because they just don't want to check and face a huge bet. Now, does doing this make even a shred of sense? No. It's suicide. Now, I don't know what he was actually thinking, but you have to figure that panic was at least a possibility, if not a probability. Now, that's not to say I think he should just be check folding. No, I mean, I still think betting is fine. But he can't go nearly that big because the bigger he goes, the likelier it is that a calling hand will beat him. So the only hands that he can get called by that he beats are going to be hands like any 9 or pocket 10s or pocket 8s or pocket 7s. Hands that are just bluff catchers. So he needs to pick a size that those hands might want to hold on against. Now, if he gets jammed on, that's really shitty, but that's not as shitty as free rolling yourself. If he does bet and get jammed on, now he can consider folding pretty heavily since he's going to be against full houses or a higher straight pretty often versus the 2-5 field. Very often. So had he bet, say, I don't know, $345, which was under half pot and leaving himself about maybe $800 back or maybe $700, I don't know what he had, but, would I bluff off with 5-4 or 5-5? Maybe. Not likely, though. I'd be weary about doing this to someone I don't have that much history with because even though the 2-5 field does overfold a ton of spots, they tend not to when they have a big hand. That's actually when they start calling too much, and the field loses a ton of money in situations when they've been like semi-cold decked. The word cooler is way overused, and spots like this one where, two huge hands collided, but it's not a spot where there is simply no avoiding getting stacked under any circumstances. He did not have to get stacked here. If he bets and I jam, I'm way too likely to have it because I know he's way too likely to call. When you get to 5-10, now you can start bluffing people off big hands because they have a lot more discipline. But at 2-5, once they make a big hand, they tend to just put blinders on, and all they can think about is how attached they are to this hand because they finally made it, and if they're beat, they're just going to give it to you and be satisfied that they at least have an excuse for losing. Now, had he bet this hand and just called it off on the river, the result is the same, but against me, that's better than just overbet jamming his stack into me because then there's no chance he gets called by worse. Whereas betting medium at least gives himself some chance to get called by either a one-pair hand against me or someone else, or, if the player is willing to bluff raise, now there's at least a chance they give that a try. Now, lastly, if he had checked the river, I'd have bet pretty big, but I don't think I would have jammed because I would not have expected him to want to call a jam, so I'm not sure what size I would have picked. But assuming I wouldn't jam, then he at least would have saved himself that money. So, okay, on to the next one. So we were 7-handed, and the under the gun opened to 15. I was next to action with king-queen offsuit. I can definitely fold this, and in hindsight, maybe I just should have, but I 3-bet to 50 because the guy who opened wasn't very good, and I just expect myself to be able to play very well post-flop, so I'm not going to second-guess this too much. The small blind fish, who had folded the jack-7 straight to me, cold called, and the razor called. Now the flop was Queen, Queen, 10, 2 clubs, and I had the king of clubs. They check. I bet small going 40. The small blind called. And now the original razor started thinking for a while. He was cutting out some chips, and it really looked like he was going to check raise. And if he did, well, I wasn't going to fold just yet, but it wouldn't be something I'd be too excited to see. So this goes on for a while, but then he calls. All right. So, for now, I'll just exhale. Turn was a 6. Small blind checks. And now, this guy who had just taken a very long time to call is taking a long time again. And now he bets 120, which is a little under half the pot. I call, and the small blind folded. And the river was the 3 of clubs, so the flush gets there. Pot has 5-10. And now he bets pretty big, going for 400. So we have a very lengthy check call from this guy in the flop after opening under the gun and calling the 3-bet going multi-way. I also note that he'd done some living, but this was one of the first raises since joining and definitely his first raise under the gun. So he slowly check calls flop after almost check raising. Then he does the delayed check raise by firing the turn. Then a big drawing card rivers, but now he bets pretty big. I forgot the action, but there was another hand where I bluffed him off on the river after a flush card hit, but now this time he's blasting into it. So what the hell is going on this time? I have the king of clubs, so I block flushes. Not that I think he's doing all this with a flush draw after a big pair had already flopped, so I don't think he'd be bluffing with king jack either. But if there's any chance he is, I have a blocker to that hand. If he had only the one combo of queen jack suited, I can see him possibly betting river because he doesn't want to check and be put in a bad spot again. But if he were to bet, I would expect more of a blocking bet size. Or at the absolute most, maybe he'd go half pot. So what does he have? There was only one combo of queen 10 suited, but that hand would at least fit into this whole line. There's 3 combos of pocket 10s, and that would fit in all the same. None of the 4 combos of ace-queen could have a flush, but he could at least have the ace of clubs blocker, so ace-queen at least seemed possible. It was pretty painful to do, but I folded here because his behavior post-flop was just too weird the entire time. From how long he took to call the flop to looking like he was coming really close to raising the flop, to suddenly betting the turn into both of us when either of us can have a huge hand, to now betting big on the river after the flush card came. This was all just too much weird shit to be either a bluff or a worse value hand, and I kept asking myself, what do you think this guy is going to turn over? So fuck me, I let him have it. And the sick part is, had I just folded pre, I'd have been so tilted seeing 2 more queens flop, never ever knowing that, had I played the hand, it was just going to end up with me folding after putting another $210 in. And there's really nothing more tilting than when you're on the fence about playing a hand, folding it, and then seeing the run out would have set you up to stack like 3 people. But, sometimes we could be very presumptuous about what would have happened when the reality is we don't know. And sometimes, when we think we would have won a lot, things would have actually gotten very ugly for us. So the next hand starts with an elder statesman opening to 15 under the gun. He's not the complete typical old man coffee. This guy has actually made some thin value bets in the recent past, and overall just seems to be thinking about his decisions a little more than you're used to seeing from this profile. There was one call. I was in late position with pocket queens, and I make it 65. The raiser called, and we went heads up. The flop was Jack 6-3 rainbow, and he check called 65. I suppose I could have or should have gone bigger here. He did call from another gun, so he should have a fairly strong range, and I don't think he's going to fold any pocket pairs to one c-bet, but then again, I always think I should have gone bigger after I bet for value and get called. So the turn was another jack, and that's not what I wanted to see. So he checked and I checked. The river wasn't much better. It was an ace. Now he thought for a little while and he checked again. I came very close to checking back too, just automatically thinking there's no point in betting. He can't call with worse. But then I decided I don't think this guy is ever checking a better hand than pocket queens on the river. So even though the run out isn't very appealing, I pretty much have the nuts. So I'm just going to spit on him. The pot was about 275 and I bet 15. Maybe I can do 25, but we're probably just splitting hairs at that point. And I'm hoping to get called by a small pair that knows it's going to lose but feels too dumb for folding to such a small size, but instead he raised to 115. And I decided if I'm going to take this line, I have to call the raise and let him own me if that's what's happening. There have been too many times in the past where I've done something just like this, try to get called by something really light, then I get raised, so I fold, and then I just get shown a bluff. So I called, and he's bluffing with pocket eights. Woohoo. And the last hand worthy of mentioning from this Friday night, the straddle was on. I raised to 30 with ace-queen offsuit, and we go 4 ways. The flop was 9-10 jack, 2 diamonds, and I had the ace of diamonds. I was the third to act at a 4, and it checked to me, and we all checked. I know it's a bit of a standard flop to check, but in hindsight, I actually think betting here isn't that bad. I can triple a lot of runouts, whether the diamond comes or not. And I just felt that with the way a lot of these players play, that they could call flop, turn, and fold river with a lot of their range. And if the king comes, I can really fuck someone who only has a queen. Or just an ace or eight can give me the best hand. But all that said, there's nothing wrong with checking this, because there's still plenty of things that can work out in my favor. And, well, the turn was pretty sick. It was the king of hearts, so now there's 2 flush draws, but now I got the nuts. And now the guy who straddled, who was also the guy I just folded the king-queen to, he bets half the pot going 60. And now I'm thinking, oh, baby, here we go. It's time to cripple his queen high straight with the nuts. I make it 200. Comes back to him and he thinks for a while, surprisingly, but he calls. And the river was pretty odd. It was the queen of diamonds, so now the board has a straight on it. I can beat the board, but the front door flush has now hit, although I have the ace of diamonds. So the pot is 520, and now he bets 450. And what a silly twist this hand suddenly took. And I do fold in these spots a lot, I guess, but I actually didn't think about this for very long, and I called pretty fast, thinking maybe he just wants to push me off a chop, or I don't know. I have the diamond blocker at least. And much to my pleasant surprise, he was bluffing, but with 9-5 of hearts. So he flopped bottom pair, turned a flush draw, and then this guy bets into 3 players who can all easily have a straight. He calls my raise, then he just bluffs having the diamonds when he had the hearts. Now, I must say, I was certainly surprised he was bluffing, and also a little upset that he was bluffing, because now, of course, all that did was make me wish I'd called him before with the king-queen, now that I see he's capable, but I didn't dwell on that for too long, because that was a completely different spot. His whole line, that hand was so weird, and it just fit his line perfectly to just have a monster hand. And if anything, maybe my folding on the river to him when he bet big, when he did have something huge, made him think that maybe he can bluff me now by going big again. Now, that would be the ideal ass-kicking scenario when you correctly fold a big hand to him and then correctly call with a big hand against him when you don't beat anything except bluffs. Now, only he knows what happened factually, but I'm just going to proceed under the presumption that my fold was correct because I am Dan Arfin, and he is not. So, all right, on to the next day, which was Saturday. The first hand of interest came with me opening with king-queen off and the cutoff to 20. The small blind called. He seemed like a loose, passive, fishy player, you know, the type who will do exactly what you want him to do at a pretty high frequency. The flop came 10-8-4 rainbow, and he check-called 25. The turn was the ace of hearts, 2 hearts now, and I think I had the king of hearts, but I'm not 100% sure about that. He check-called 85 rather slowly, which usually indicates a lot of weakness. The river was a deuce. Pot has 260. And he check-folded to me, betting close to 2 times the pot when I went 490. And he didn't think that long either. Now, I don't want to get too results-oriented, but triple barreling a lot of runouts has been looking more and more profitable the last few weeks, especially when you go huge on the river. The field is getting to the river with a lot of marginal holdings, which is why they are check-calling instead of raising, and almost none of them are willing to call really light at the end. So the session goes on for a little while longer, and then came a string of 4 consecutive hands that all produced some very interesting decisions and results. Now in the first one, I opened button with pocket 4s, and the big blind called. The big blind was this white woman with glasses. She seemed kind of like a rec reg. You know, she only bought in with 400 or 500, and she was playing tight and definitely trying hard, but she also struck me as someone who's probably going to make a lot of glaring mistakes. The flop came queen 8-6, 2 diamonds. She check-called 25, and here we go again. I'm bracing myself for a potential triple barrel yet again, but we'll see. A lot of other things have to happen first. The turn was another 8, and it was also a club. I had a club, although I didn't think it mattered too much for this spot. She checked, and after taking some time, I checked back, knowing all along that this is for sure what I'm going to do. The river made the backdoor flush with the deuce, and then she bet 15 into, I guess, 95. And once again, I thought, okay, great, here's a perfect spot to just run her the fuck over, because since she joined the game, she hadn't really seen me do anything yet, as I hadn't gotten to too many playable spots, so I gave her the good news and raised her to 180, which is about 1.4x pot. And out of all the bluffs I've ran the last few weeks, this was the one I was the least worried about succeeding. So she's thinking for a little while, actually starting to wonder why this is taking so long. And then, of course, she calls. Well, I'll be. So I turn my hand over and she shows the winner. Just queen 10 off, no club. All right. It's a terrible call against the field, but it's a good call against me because I have never used this size for value. With her block betting so tiny on the river, I'd have figured she'll just never call anything significant, so I got to keep it small if I rivered either a flush or a boat. So I don't know why she called, but as I've told many people many times, when you're bluffing, sometimes they just call you, and it's just variance. You don't know why they called, and they may not know either. All they know is they didn't feel like folding this time, and they happened to feel that way at the right time. But, as we all know, the best time to catch a strong hand is right after you lose a big pot. Now, this certainly isn't what you'd call a big pot by any stretch, but you might say it was big enough and dramatic enough with her calling pretty light against a 1.4x river bluff raise that it could get me to steam raise the next hand. But my next hand was pocket queens, so not bad for a steam raise. I make a 20 from the cutoff, and it falls to the big blind, who was an Aria reg playing at the win on this Saturday evening, and he makes it 90. Now, we're both deep, and I figured there's at least a chance he's squeezing light, so that's one reason I didn't want to 4-bet. And plus, I don't really care to 4-bet queens in position against a deep stack in general. If I get 5-bet, I am going to puke and probably fold, and it's just going to be hard to get called by anything except either maybe for ace-king or jacks, so I think calling here plays well, keeps my range wide, and fairly under-repped when I have a hand this strong. The flop comes jack 8-3, 2 spades, and I have a spade. He checks, and I don't think he's checking to fold too often, so once again I can probably get away with betting a little bigger, but I still bet 80 into 180, and he calls. The turn was another 3, and he checks again. I don't think he'd have ever checked anything too strong on the flop. I think the strongest holding he'd ever have right now is like top pair with a weak kicker like jack 10. But having just bluff raised the river in the prior hand, I started telling myself a story where he probably wouldn't think I'm going to just start blasting off the next hand, so I was worried he'd fold turn if I bet again. And even though there's a bunch of rivers that I won't like, most of the time I won't mind the river. So I got a little crafty and I checked back. And the river was pretty sick. It was another 3. Now he bets 250, and he did it kind of fast. The pot was 340 when he did that, and I think given the line I took, there's no debate that I have to raise. So I worked it for a little while, and I made it 640, and he instantly folded. Now, because he snap folded, I figured maybe he was bluffing with just a weak ace high or something, but it's possible he just had like 9s or 10s and figured this line isn't going to be a bluff, so he can just fold without hesitation. But either way, I still like this turn check. Because if he did fold a value hand that fast, then I very much doubt I'd have gotten 3 streets anyway. Or my turn check did induce a river bluff instead of just betting turn and taking that chance away from him. Now, I haven't played a ton with this guy, but he's been around a while, so he must have some idea about what he's doing. And plus, when you're playing against regs, you have to balance your lines a lot more often than you do against fish, where you can afford to play exploitable against all day long, knowing full well that 1, they're probably not going to be able to capitalize on it, and 2, you're unlikely to see them again. Whereas the regs, you got to deal with them on a consistent basis. So alright, so I got picked off at the pocket 4s, but won a pot bigger than that one the very next hand, and now in this next hand, now I have kings. Well. So I raised to 20, and the woman who was now the button this hand called. We go heads up, and the flop comes jack 5-4, 2 hearts. I do not have a heart. I bet 25, and she raised to 65, and right away, I'm pumping my fist, thinking this is going to be top pair a lot. She thinks I'm a bluffer and that she can afford to raise with this kind of hand. And based on her sizing, I thought it's just very unlikely she has a huge hand, so I even considered 3-betting the flop. And as I was thinking about that, I was just also thinking, gee, when is the last time I've done this? I mean, this would be like a throwback to 2006 or something. But I didn't do that. I just called. And the turn was pretty much a brick. It was a 9. The pot is 170. I check, and she bets 100. Now, she wasn't really deep, but at this point, she was pretty deep. And then I did something I haven't done in a long time, but used to do far too often, and that was risk putting myself in a horrible spot. Now, this turn size really isn't that small. I mean, it's not that big, but it's not so small that I should have no doubt that kings are still the best hand. And I've said this before, that whenever I show a bluff, I always regret it because I start leveling myself later in spots, thinking people are either playing back at me or just overvaluing hands. But in actuality, nothing has changed. And they're just doing the same things they normally do, which is nut pedal. Now, this woman who had called me bluffing would be the type to pick off that size at random. I mean, if it was against some typical Vegas reg, I very much doubt that bluff would have gone down. And oftentimes when you're playing against players who you can tell aren't awful, but also aren't very experienced, are more prone to using strange sizes when they have big hands. And because she raised small on the flop and didn't bet huge on the turn, I thought she'd have top pair a lot and probably wouldn't fold it and might check back a lot of rivers, so I just raised. I raised to 305. Now, I don't mind the check raise. The problem with it was I didn't know what I was going to do if she jams, and if that's where you're at, then you probably shouldn't put yourself in this spot. Now, if my mind is made up that I'm either check raise folding or calling it if she jams, then fine. Go ahead and raise. But if you're going to reopen the betting in a spot where you're just not sure what you're going to do if they re-raise, you're really asking for trouble. So she's thinking for a little while. Then she exhales and blows some air out, puffing her cheeks, slouches her shoulders and sighs, and jams.
Oh no!
Fuck me. Now her jam was another 570 into like 780. And I was so sickened by this because her jam was just like, it was just big enough that it could be a nutted hand, but it was also just small enough that it could just be a top pair she's going with. Now, normally when people do the whole Hollywood show like she did, they just have a set or something close to that, like, every time. But given the stack sizes in this pot, it seemed plausible, and it still seems plausible, that she may have just been not sure what to do, and knows that I'm either bluffing or I have her crushed, and now it's just deciding if this is the moment to go with it or not because she just doesn't want to see a bad river. But then I started thinking, this woman seems like she's being really careful, and she's winning since she sat down, so is she really trying to risk it all now with just one pair in this spot? I mean, she knows she just caught me bluffing, but does she really think I'm doing it again, literally 2 hands later? I was really stuck for a decision, and while I was tanking, I told her, like, I got a really big hand. And she didn't say anything, but I was trying to get a reaction, and I didn't get much of one. Of course, not getting much of a reaction is a reaction. So I guess it just seemed like she was waiting for her money, as there was little doubt she'd lose, so between that, the Hollywood performance, and just the fact that she had raised my flop bet and 3-bet jammed a lot of money over my turn check raise, which was not something she'd done anything like to this point. It just seemed like, all right, I guess she's got it. I mean, it's not that unlikely. There are 8 combos of either a set of 5s, 4s, or 2 pair for 5-4. Plus there's 3 more combos of pocket jacks in case she didn't want to 3-bet that pre, but I still couldn't stop thinking that maybe she's just got one of the 12 combos of ace-jack and thinks it's the nuts. But even though she called me light with the queen-10, I don't think she's getting piles in too light here, so fuck me, fuck my life, fuck everything I've ever done, and I folded ever so painfully.
Oh!
And another reason why I told her I had a huge hand while I was thinking was to get her to show me that all she had was a jack afterward, whereas if she had me crushed, I don't think she'd show me anything. And she didn't show, so I at least didn't have to feel bad about that. And a while later, when she had the button again, I opened and saw that she had called my raise with jack-6 suited, so that just made me think it's even more likely she had me crushed because she could have flopped 2 pair with jack-5 suited or jack-4 suited. But that wasn't until later. First, we had to finish out this 4th straight hand where I had a lot to think about, and now I have pocket queens again. So pocket 4s, pocket queens, pocket kings, pocket queens in 4 straight hands. So I open to 20. She calls and the big blind calls. The flop is 6-deuce-5 rainbow, and I bet 45, and only the woman calls. And yes, I know what the solvers and all the fucking online poker nerds say, okay? When someone is in position and flats a raise and this is the flop, you have to check your whole range because they have the nut advantage and blah, 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 blah. Fuck you, I don't care. This woman is not good, and I don't care what an excruciating dilemma I just had against her because it was my fault for putting myself in that spot in the first place. I should have just fucking called the turn and seen what she does on the river. But I didn't. And I know that I'm going to look very tilted to her after losing that pot with the kings, so I expect her to call very wide on this flop when I, once again, have another really big overpair. I don't want her checking back a hand that she would call with. It happens all the time in 2-5. So the turn was the 8 of spades, 2 spades now, and I have a spade. It's an interesting card since it hits her very hard. She may have me smash now, but if she doesn't, then there's a good chance she has a lot of outs. I expected her to raise the turn if she can beat my hand, and will only call if she has a pair plus hand, so I bet close to the pot size going 135, and she calls. And now the river is the 7 of spades. Perfect. Backdoor flush hits, and now there's 4 to a straight. Pot has 420, and I check. Of course, praying she just checks down, and even then I can still lose to a lot of 2 pairs, but she bets. Awesome. Although she didn't bet big, in fact she bet quite small, going to just 100, but I still snap folded. I mean, she's already shown us that she doesn't necessarily always bet huge with a big hand, so she probably figures I have a lot of hands that can't stand a big bet, so she may as well go small to try and get called by something, but it just is what it is. She has to have it. I lose once again. So, 4 straight thought-provoking hands. 3 of them started with monsters, but I only won 1 of them. The 2 I lost were to the recreational player, and the 1 I won was against the rec. Sounds about right, doesn't it? Now, there was one final hand worth mentioning. The guy who I mentioned in episode 7 who had slow-rolled the shit out of somebody, taking forever to call with the nut straight after being jammed into on the turn. He opens to 15, the cutoff called, and I 3-bet to 60 with king-queen of diamonds, and they both called. The flop stunk. It was king 6-4 with 2 diamonds, and now the slow roller donks into both of us for 100. The first guy folds, and it's really tempting to raise with this hand since I'm almost certainly ahead, and it's hard to imagine him bet folding anything for that size, but this guy was clicking all over the place and just playing so bizarre that I just didn't want to give him a chance to get off easy just in case he does have some really stupid hand. So I call, and if you agreed the flop was bad, the turn was even worse. It was a queen, so now I've got top 2 pair. And he bets $100 again. First it was 100 into 180, but now it's into 380. Now we know he's clearly not that strong, and there's very few rivers, if any, that I won't like seeing, but because this guy is so weird, I didn't want to just sit around and call a second time, so I raise him to 300. He thinks for a little while, and he calls. And the river was the 9 of diamonds. So I make the second nut flush. Certainly is nice to hit the flop, the turn, and the river. Not only did I do that, I also went 5 for 5 with the community cards. Every card on the board helped my hand. Must be nice, huh? Oh yeah, it is. Feels damn good. Except this time, I probably would have preferred the diamond didn't hit because I didn't think he had a flush draw. And as long as I'm correct, now the flush is just one more hand he has to be afraid of, but he checks. Pot has 980. I know I can't afford to go huge here since he's clearly weak, so I bet 430. He tanks for a while, and he calls. And then the whole table gasped when they saw just how sick of a run out this hand was for me. So it felt nice to land a shot on the guy who had slow rolled. He really was good company afterward, but fuck him. I don't care what anyone says or how funny they think it is. I don't care to ever see anyone get slow rolled. You know, poker is brutal enough just with people fast rolling. So we don't need to rub the soul-crushing defeats in their face and make them feel even worse than they already do. And I say all the time that poker is a war and there shall be no mercy, but I feel you can still achieve all that without cock-teasing anyone. But alright, that's enough for today. On to the next session. I hope you enjoyed these hand histories, and we'll talk again soon.